Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I am joined by an elusive man, a man who allegedly does not exist, and for the first time, if my memory serves me correctly, appearing on this wonderful channel is my good friend, a founding member of the Old Glory Club, and a man whose writings and whose career sets off a bright future ahead of him, Mr. Ryan Turnipseed. How are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, just not to date when this was being recorded. Actually, it won't matter because I won't date myself by saying this. I just got off the air with Orrin McIntyre. We were talking about the potentiality for Trump's second term and what that might mean with respects to his nominations for various cabinet level positions. And when I was doing that, I was invoking the paleoconservative, neoconservative fights that we saw in the 1970s and 80s and have kind of reflashed themselves today with the quote unquote new right of the 2020s. And I thought, who better to talk about the history of the betrayal of the American right and these fights between various conservative factions than yourself? So I figured that we would come on and talk about this, and you're a well-read man on this sort of history, so let's get into it.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate it because I've recently been going on the rhetorical or media warpath against the conservative movement that we'll be discussing. That's actually the new right, as it's historically been termed. We'll discuss why, but they aren't good people. They're still around today. There's a new generation of them, and they are basically all just trying to stunt us. So this is very timely, I think.
Oh, I thought it was incredibly timely as soon as the election results had poured in, or just a couple of weeks ago, because as soon as that came in, my first thought was there's going to be so much, momentum that people are going to try and seize, but also wrestle away. Earlier this year, I was reading some of the essays that were edited and put together by Bob Whitaker of the infamous New Right papers, all these various position pieces that were taking place in the midst of the 1980s election and the Reagan Revolution, and what they had hoped to accomplish, not just undoing the administrative state, shrinking the size of the federal bureaucracy, but also trying to get things like the FDR, New Deal apparatus destroyed, or at least at the very least deconstructed, while at the same time trying to reinstitute some degree of freedom of association and fighting with this emerging wave of progressive attitudes, especially on sex, with women's liberation. And I couldn't help but read through so many of these essays and think, oh my goodness, we are fighting the same battles that these gentlemen were fighting 40 and 50 years ago. And not much has particularly changed. The state has gotten larger. The progressive movement has made huge strides. And I think until the Dobbs decision, I had yet to really see a Supreme Court case swing in a non-leftist direction. Just to even get to status quo ante of Roe v. Wade is a huge move to the right, politically speaking, which we had covered on your channel when that decision was leaked to the press. So it's been a hot minute since you and I've had a political and punditry-based conversation. But I read those papers and I thought, wow, so much of what had happened back then, disintermediation via direct mailers, in the same way we try to be disintermediating through the media with our own Twitter accounts, our own podcasts, and the rest. So many parallels and similarities that now that Trump's in office, that was the first thought that came to my mind, or that will be in office, now that he won the election, was that this kind of fight is going to happen again. And my fear, which is grounded in history, is that the worst people imaginable are going to seize any momentum and try and contain it.
Yeah, and that was that was my analysis basically the night of the election this month. There's your date. But I was most impressed by the fact that basically all of the abortion measures, except for just a few on the state level, just failed. Florida succeeded because it has an unusually high bar of 60% needed to make such a thing an amendment to legalize abortion or anything else, really. So, Florida was saved, and it also isn't necessarily ruled by the usual conservative class. DeSantis did disappoint during the primaries, but I don't think he is the business as usual GOP. But interestingly, you saw states like Missouri legalize abortion on the state level. which is very strange. Missouri is a Midwestern state. It was one of the hearts, if you will, of the isolationist movement. It's usually known for being very right wing. A lot of good stuff happens there. So why is it that this very Christian conservative state was completely unable to keep something like abortion banned on the state level, while also Donald Trump won the presidency, which was also strange for a number of reasons, but it shows that he either overpowered any cheating mechanisms that were in place, like we saw in 2020, or there just weren't those in place to begin with for whatever reason. That's not the focus of the stream, of course, speculating as to why or if. But what we did see was basically this last election, Christian conservatism completely fell apart. It was unable to defend. If Christian conservatism can't defend Missouri, you really have to start asking what's the Christian conservative base? Where is it? Who is it? Because it doesn't seem to exist much anymore. So that was a very interesting signifier, especially to me, because there's two ways of looking at the recent history of the American right. You mentioned Whitaker's New Right papers, which is a very good collection. The other way, and these aren't conflicting or dichotomous. They're just different perspectives that actually tend to fit together rather well. The other perspective on the recent history of the American right is Murray Rothbard's betrayal of the American right, which can seem leftist tinged at times, but given Rothbard's writings and thoughts in the 90s, I would venture to guess that that's just him not wording things as carefully as he would later in life. But quite interestingly, Christian conservatism was not a political force in the United States until the 1960s and 70s. Even then, it only became powerful, really, in the 80s and 90s. So, what we saw this last election was that this newish force, which was fighting a very bitter war against the right wing that was before it, which is the old right in Rothbard's view, this newish force of Christian conservatism basically just completely lost their support base, and it's been supplanted by whatever new right wing that Donald Trump represents. Something that's hopefully a little bit less containment, but that remains to be seen with this second chance. So that was why I was particularly interested in this topic at basically the same time as you. We had this weird furcation during the election where the Christian conservatives lost, but the right wing populists won. So I think that's reason enough to investigate this.
Absolutely. And I mean, Murray Rothbard, towards the end of his life in the 1990s, he had famously wrote the essay A Strategy for the Right, where he had sort of given his last throw in the hat in the ring for Pat Buchanan, and was explicitly advocating for a right-wing populist strategy that would win elections. Now, this wouldn't be realized until this New York billionaire real estate mogul runs down the elevator in 2015. And it's certainly been his era of politics for now almost 10 years. But of course, Rothbard, was a visionary in his own right, writing in the Lou Rockwell report in the early 1990s, sort of prophesying the death of what we would probably call conservative libertarianism, with the modal libertarian individual and that personality, which has certainly made its face well known in the 2024 Libertarian Party candidate, Chase Oliver. So, I mean, just an absolute modal libertarian and an absolute disaster, which has made libertarianism quite laughable in the face of many. But at the same time, I look at how Christian conservatism, whether it would be in the wake of the Dobbs decision, finding to take the victory that they had been given, and instead of saying, well, let's run with it, we're going to be anti-Trump, and he's not going for a full abortion ban, and because he's not acting within the realm of political realism, where we can't avow him. And at the same time, we've witnessed, and as you are very personally aware, this great liberal behemoth move throughout seminaries, move throughout various churches. Not a single church or denomination has been spared from this, trying to oust young men and conservative leaders and factions. And now you have all these very progressive post-war consensus liberalism as their confession of faith, which is quite disheartening to see. And they have made themselves effectively very much, they won't call themselves Democrats, but they, for all intents and purposes, in the worldly and political sense, they are, because they're against the camp that is at the head of the Republican Party, at least in terms of being at the front of the ballot, which is Donald Trump. And I've noticed this too, and I'm sure that you had observed it as well, that in the 2024 Democratic National Convention, the Democratic Party was trying very hard alongside that awful and blasphemous, he gets us advertisement campaign, invoking Christ in the way that they have, to try and reclaim the title of being Christian, more so than what has always been seen as, evangelical right-wing voters, as it's been taken for granted for decades in the United States. So a lot of things have certainly changed, or at least they seem to be changing.
Right, and to that point about the sort of Christian conservative slide leftward, that's a rhetorical tool that I will use, and relative to how it was maybe 10 years ago or so, it's correct. But as we'll discuss, Christian conservatism might not have always been as right wing as it may have once appeared to us to be in the past. So, what I'm saying is, when Christian conservatism first entered the scene, it was at heart and in action an extremely moderating and gatekeeping force that put down radical right wingers. And there was a period of time where that kind of went away, probably because the radical right wingers were all gone. They didn't need to be gate kept anymore. They were in their own little silos and groups. But now we're sort of seeing this resurgence of the radical right hitting somewhere near the mainstream. So, like clockwork, Christian conservatism has reactivated as a gatekeeping mechanism and a moderating force to defend the center. So we'll get into that, but that's personal to me. That is relevant history to us. It's in some respects, it's not even history. It's still here with us. It didn't change.
And that's exactly how I felt with respects to, it didn't change. There's a very famous clip, I want to say it's from 1974, 1976, on the Johnny Carson show. And it's a very famous clip of Johnny Carson talking to Governor Ronald Reagan of California. And he is listing out very observable problems about the American government and American politics that, we would identify as key tenets of Reaganism, but I mean are still very real tenets of basic conservative or right-wing thought today, about the size of the state and the amount of dependence that you have on it, which of course means that you have a client that needs to be taken care of either through entitlement spending or through government sinecures and the rest. And at the same time, he's referring to the issues of how there is not enough money to go around, that inflation is a problem, and that we are dealing with multiple foreign policy debacles, and that there needs to be a real change in direction in Washington. Now, of course, Gerald Ford is going to be at the head of the ticket in the 1976 election, losing to Jimmy Carter. But I mean, to hear that almost 50 years ago, was rather this sobering. I don't want to call it a black bill, but it was sobering to say, we really have not moved the needle that much with respects to the same problems that were being talked about by prominent conservative or prominent Republican figures nearly 50 years ago. The problems instead have gotten much worse, and with much worse demographics. And so I guess that brings us to the 50 years ago and into the 1970s, because as I'm sure Trump has his camp of loyalists and a roster and a bench that he has that is deeper than the one he had in his first term. I cannot help but think about the battles between paleoconservatives, Christian conservatives, the quote-unquote new right of the 1970s and 80s, and the neoconservative and other containment factions back then, and how much those kind of battles are still with us, and how those kind of battles are going to be very public and very dirty in this coming administration.
Right, and that's exactly right. So, not to belabor the importance anymore. Hopefully you and your audience could tolerate just a little bit of background for. It's what Rothbard terms the old right, and it's what most paleoconservatives would term, original conservatism. But I think it would be good to sort of detail the emergence of this right-wing movement that got supplanted sometime in the last century. So you ready to go on to that point?
Let's do it.
Awesome. So Um, I'm going to start sort of at the end of FDR's presidency and the Truman administration's reign, just because I feel like you and your audience would be very familiar with them. They probably know they were raging leftists. They are responsible mostly for the managerial class gaining its primacy in the United States. So all that doesn't need to be elaborated upon or belabored. What we do need to know is that there was a new realignment on the American right in response to FDR during this. And it was, from our, or at least from my point of view, rather positive. What we saw is that the sort of Southern conservatives and a lot of more, I guess we call them right-wing libertarians or sort of more right-wing liberal types in the Midwest started to align together. Um, and they would split on various issues. This isn't like a hard coalition, but rather what we see is that this is the right wing in America. We have Southern conservatives, which have been noted at great length to be one of the few truly right wing forces in the United States. And as we'll get to in a moment, it was basically killed mercilessly by what's going to supplant this coalition that we're talking about. And then there's these more libertarian groups coming out of the coming out of the Great Plains and the Midwest. And then to explain the libertarian groups just a little bit, what we see is that most of them are extremely anti-New Deal, extremely anti-government intervention into the economy, and very much isolationist on the geopolitical scale. And this is going to be important not because I'm strictly advocating for all those positions right now, even though I might find them to be beneficial, but because they're going to directly relate to how this group was ousted from power. But why would these positions be important to America? Well, it's in fact government intervention that prevents things like discrimination. It's discrimination that allows people to build communities, societies, functioning economies. Whenever having a choice and then making a choice is itself an act of discrimination. The negative connotation around the word is a very fundamental victory of the civil rights revolution from the 60s. Discrimination on its own as a concept is good. Government intervention that prevents discrimination, therefore, then prevents things like forming communities, having real communities with or an organic nature to it, something that's more firm than what we have now. They're important for economic development. So if you're wondering why has the economy stagnated, among the other many reasons for it, it's because we can't actually choose the best economic options available to us. It's because the businessmen aren't allowed to do it either. It is this issue that the Midwestern, more libertarian groups fought against when they fought against FDR. And it was partly discrimination and partly anti-socialism would be a good way to describe it, that led them to this position. So we have these two different right-wing forces that are opposed to FDR's New Deal, and this makes up like the backbone of the old right. They'd be represented by Senator Taft in the 50s and early 60s, who is the most staunch isolationist in the Senate. At least that's how his reputation is. And it's also these groups that were very socially conservative. This is the other part that becomes relevant, especially as we get to the 90s and 2000s. Both of these groups, despite their differences, the Southern Democratic Bloc was much more populist economically. They were welfarists, would be one way to describe them, whereas the Midwesterners, the Great Plains groups, were not really. They were all very socially right-wing. They had very little tolerance for any of the left-wing revolutions that we will see in the 60s and 70s. So that's our groups in the old right. And even the Southern Democratic Bloc had some libertarian influences. For instance, the much derided phrase by most modern right-wingers, the taxation is theft meme, comes from a very influential book from the 1950s. This was a book that was influential for this old right bloc, even to like the legislative houses. So this is libertarianism before it turned into social leftism and moderate deregulation. And this is libertarian in its much more radical form. This was a rather organic part of the American old right. So that's the scene that's being set here. They have a lot of very influential writers. The foundation of economic education was very old right in its beginning. You had a lot of very influential newspaper owners and media contributors. Colonel McCormick, coming out from the state of Illinois, a famous World War I veteran, was a member of this old right. There's some arguments that Hearst, the great media mogul from the Hearst family, was an old rightist. So, as you can see, there's some variation, but most of us in our spheres would recognize them all to be right wing in some capacity or totally. Um, that's the background. Did you have anything that you wanted to touch on before we got to the 60s and 70s, Prude?
Well, no, I would agree that it is fundamentally a reaction to FDR's New Deal and the regime that came. I think that the most foundational piece of literature that's accessible, at least for people to chime in, of course, would be reading Garrett Garrett's "The Revolution Was." And I mean, you get a great list of names from that revolution was, and basically really all of the People's Potash. And then, of course, in the strategy for the right, Rockwell outlines quite a series of names in the disparate camps of thought who were both socially conservative, but also were fundamentally aware of what this expansion of the federal government would mean for the way of life as they knew it. And I mean, that includes Garrett Garrett, this includes Alfred J. Knox, this includes numerous other names as well, who realized that the style of even the progressivism of its day, which of course its standard of being progressive compared to today would make them look like hard right ethno-nationalists that these liberals are terrified exist under their pillows and inside their closets when the lights go out. But no, I think everything that you've outlined so far is a pretty clear genealogy of what we mean by old right, or what might be called new right come the 1980s.
Right, and I'm sure that I can send you a link to put Rothbard's strategy for the right and some of the other stuff in the description here.
Oh,
But
I can. And our good friend Skeptical Waves has a great audio rendition for the Rockwell essay strategy for the right, which I recommend people listen to.
yes, fantastic. So, moving into the really the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, this anti-New Deal coalition gets snubbed pretty hard by the GOP. So a lot of the GOP establishment really favored Eisenhower as their post-New Deal leader. Eisenhower ran on a platform of moderately scaling back the New Deal in some places, and then in other places abolishing some of its programs. Uh, However, none of this really came to fruition. It's Eisenhower that basically cemented the New Deal as a permanent program, at least for what we have now, like Social Security and all these other measures that were supposed to be social safety nets for the Depression. It's Eisenhower that has kept them up to this day. He fundamentally reshaped the GOP away from its more libertarian and isolationist elements, and he made the GOP very much a internationalist and more interventionist party, which has some merits, but I would certainly say a lot more demerits. After all, if we had a party that was anti-intervention, as we've seen, it turns out to look much more right-wing than perhaps what we had in the 90s and early 2000s, just to give us a modern point of reference. So this is like some of the first signs of this old right coalition starting to falter. And then there's also a lot of changes of opinions among the old right, and then some of the people dying off. A lot of if I remember correctly, a lot of the newspaper organizers just died, and their successors were not as far right as they were. And then you had the Foundation of Economic Education, FEE, which is still around today, but at this time took a much more internationalist direction. The right very much got pulled into internationalism by the GOP, which is unfortunate because the GOP was supposed to be very much isolationist, more focused on economic development. This was a fundamental restructuring of the party. But we also see a very important and very sinister media outlet get established in this late 50s, early 60s era, and that's the National Review. So To begin with, there's some very interesting lines of inquiry regarding the origins and purposes of the National Review. Bill Buckley's sister, if I remember correctly, was a CIA agent. Bill Buckley was in Mexico City as a CIA agent. There was a pretty, and this is all in Rothbard's book. He notes that if someone tells you that they are no longer a CIA agent, that you're basically to disregard it because it's just a cover for another op, which makes sense. That's if you were an intelligence agency, you would probably do the same thing. If you want someone to go undercover, say in civic life, to influence national politics, you'd probably tell them that they are no longer in the CIA if anyone asks. So there's some instant suspicion. But who was in the CIA, or in this National Review new media organization? There were a lot of ex-Trotskyites, ex-Stalinists, and some people that you really can't tell that they dropped the communism, but they say some right-wing things at some points. So I would highly recommend everyone in the audience after the stream just goes and reads the book, because Rothbard goes through every one of them. You know, there was like communist youth organizers turned capitalists, supposedly, that were writing for the National Review. Burnham was famously an ex-Trotskyite. There were a bunch more else. So this is a very important cohort in this National Review group. They are also very militantly against the sort of libertarianism and isolationism of the old right. The other group that wrote for this National Review was almost universally Roman Catholic monarchists, usually of European abstraction. Not that they were multi-generational European Americans, but that they were just coming straight from Europe to write to the United States about how Catholic monarchism, Catholic social institutions that were ordained by the Pope, say, would very much strengthen American society and would be actually right-wing. Rothbard is a little bit less hard on these people, especially because they tended to be a lot less economically idiotic than the post-Trotskyite, post-communist camp. But one does have to wonder, why is the Roman Catholic Bill Buckley basically importing a whole cohort of European Catholic monarchists to tell the Americans they aren't really right-wing enough, and to be right-wing you need to have Stuart Jacobite restorations in the United Kingdom, or restoring the Habsburgs in the Austrian Empire. It does seem a bit strange that this Bill Buckley, this Roman Catholic Yale graduate who has heavy connections to the CIA, just magically whips together a group of ex-communists and Roman Catholic monarchists to hijack the right wing. And that's what he did. He had very high production value right out of the gate. He had a lot of media connections, a lot of politicians' connections, so he got a lot of good interviews. And this is during an era where media was entirely centralized into channels. Of course, I'm referring to radio and television. It's not like today where you have multi-directional media that's heavily decentralized, like you and I proved on this podcast. You can't do that in 1950 and 1960. So Bill Buckley has a very good weapon in his arsenal right out of the gate, magically, to completely transform the right. And that's what he does. So this is the National Review camp. This is one section of what we're going to call the new right. And this new right is going to supplant the old right. So you can kind of tell just by the contrast in ideology, the people behind it, their former ideological opinions. You can kind of tell between the old right and the new right which one is more American, which one's more right-wing, which one is probably in our best interest, just given their, say, intelligence connections or lack thereof for one of the camps. But this is not all. This is not the only part of the new right. There are other groups of somewhat conservative interventionists that are basically going to leave the left. And if you can believe it, this group of post-leftists, if you will, their main tagline is that they didn't change, the left left them. So I'm of course referring to the neoconservatives, these people that used to be left-wing liberals on mostly the East Coast and New England and the Mid-Atlantic, largely of Ashkenazi extract. And these people still kept their views. It's just that the left went a little bit further to the left. So they started calling themselves neoconservatives, especially Crystal. And these two groups kind of coalesce, the National Review right and the neoconservatives. And that's the majority of our new right force up until about the 1980s. So when we get to the 1980s, I'll introduce like the last member of this new right coalition. But did you? It looked like you wanted to say something.
Oh, when you said the left left me, I said, there's a passage in Ecclesiastes that tells you that there really is nothing new under the sun. But in addition to that, I think a very important thing to consider as well with these emerging factions is that the post-war conservatism in the United States, very quickly after the death of a lot of these newspaper editors, for instance, Garrett Garrett was a well-known writer and editor at the Saturday Evening Post. He also wrote for the Chicago Tribune. That a lot of these, quite a few newspapers pre-war and in the interwar and in the 1930s and 40s, were very conservative newspapers. And shortly after the deaths of these editors, quickly do we see their influence on media and public opinion sort of decrease in the wake of radio and television, and as things get formally organized into channels. And then, of course, with Buckley's rise in the 1968 election and the infamous debates that he has with author Gore Vidal, that you sort of see the rise of talking head rank punditry as we know it. There's actually a really great documentary on that debate that I recommend people watch when they get the chance. Kelsey Grammer voices the thoughts and diaries of William F. Buckley. It's actually it's a good documentary. But on top of that, you also see what I think can only be described as the de-Anglicization, or the sort of old stock not take its place in these emerging new right or these National Review sections. And Sam Francis points this out quite well in his book Beautiful Losers. He writes, and I'll just read this passage here. It's on page 227. He says, quote, "In any case, the old right intellectuals, for the most part, had few links with the grassroots, the popular middle class, and WASP nucleus of traditional American culture. National Review itself was not only a Manhattanite, but also an Ivy League and Roman Catholic in its orientation, as well as ex-communist and ethnic in its editorial composition, and not a few of its brightest stars in the 1950s were personally eccentric, if not outright neurotic. Moreover, a few of them reflected on the Protestant establishment that by the end of World War II had largely made its peace with the new regime and was scurrying to secure its own future within the managerial state, economy, and culture. Of the 25 conservative intellectuals whose photographs appeared on the dust jacket of George H. Nash's The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America since 1945, published in 1976, 4 are Roman Catholic, 7 are Jewish, another 7, including 3 Jews, are foreign-born, 2 are Southern or Western in origin, and only 5 in any respect representative of the historically dominant Anglo-Saxon, or at least Anglo-Celtic, Protestant strain in American history and culture, and 3 of 5 of them later converted to Roman Catholicism," end quote.
Right, and this is something also noted by Rothbard. However, he doesn't, maybe because this was written in the 70s, but Rothbard does not really seem to think that the Anglo-Protestant establishment so much, establishment and opposition, so much made peace with the managerial regime as much as the opposition kind of got snuffed out. And in fact, he does have this very interesting sentence here, writing a little bit before Sam Francis, but that's not to detract from Francis, more just to tell people that Rothbard might be worth reading, even if you have preconceptions that libertarians aren't worth reading. He does say it was the essence of National Review as an anti-communist organ that accounted for its being a coalition of ex-Stalinists and Trotskyites and younger Catholics, and led observers to remark on the curious absence of American Protestants, who had of course been the staple of the old right. So this is an interesting thing that Rothbard even notes, is that this new right is fundamentally foreign in religion, in ideology, and even in ethnicity. So this is a very sort of crucial shift, and you can kind of see that today on our Supreme Court, if you wanted to. It's there's not many Protestants left on it, just as an example. But beyond this, and before we introduce our last coalition member of this new right coalition that's forming, we've already gone over the National Review and the neoconservatives. There's one crucial mechanism that we can't pass over, and that is the the gatekeeping mechanism of red baiting. One of the things that Rothbard first jumped on from Bill Buckley that sort of signaled that Bill Buckley was going to be a subversive compromiser, if you will, and we'll get to that in a moment, compromiser in particular, was that Bill Buckley had a very famous essay where he basically just said that he believed in liberty, he was basically an anarchist. However, so long as the communists exist on the other side of the world, we must accept a totalitarian bureaucracy on our shores to basically lead a global crusade against communism. Now, some right-wingers, especially in our audience, might have a knee-jerk reaction and say based or something along those lines. But you do have to keep in mind what's going on here. The old right and the American people, the American traditions, are fundamentally at odds with something like a totalitarian bureaucracy, which is what a global crusade against anything would cost, especially right now. A totalitarian bureaucracy is very much the antithesis of the American people. So when you have this future intellectual leader of the right-wing movement writing for this, there's a very interesting mechanism at play. You can either say, no, I reject this, in which case the new right media is going to call you a commie sympathizer, a defeatist, a pig-headed isolationist, all these things which basically just say, you don't actually want to destroy the big evil, you just want the big evil to win. Or you can agree with them, but then you've sort of ceded the original thing you were trying to defend, which for the old right was the American way of life and the American people. This is, in Rothbard's portrayal of the American right, this is called red baiting. And he kind of sheds a negative light on it'd be Representative McCarthy. No, Senator. Yeah. It would be, he shines a negative light on McCarthy. Specifically because McCarthy kind of unwittingly caused this to be the case by enshrining foreign communism as the greatest evil to the American people. What happens is a dynamic that emerges where subverters, gatekeepers, and moderating influences on the right can suddenly push through a whole load of leftist bull under the guise of defeating communism. And since you've already agreed that communism is the greatest evil to ever exist, there's not much you can really do to oppose that without reneging on that, without losing your reputation as an anti-communist, which is especially a big deal during the Cold War. And this Red Scare, the second Red Scare, though many of us right now on the right correctly view it as correct, McCarthy basically had a 1-to-1 ratio of accusations to actual communists in the government. What it unwittingly did is it put the old right in a position where it crumbled. And this is very important to understand. And this is you can kind of see this in the modern day. We'll get there towards the end of this, I assume, with just interventionism. You have to support some sort of foreign war, or else you just want America to fall to terrorism or whatever else. That's a little bit outdated. Not entirely, because the same people that push that narrative are still in government to this day. So this is just something to keep in mind. This foreign subversive group of ex-Trotskyites, ex-Stalinists, Roman Catholic monarchists, non-Anglo-Protestants, really did the old right in by red baiting them, is what's called. This isn't to say that communism is good or that it can be set aside or anything. Certainly the founder of anarcho-capitalism would claim no such thing. I think that'd be obvious to everyone. Rather, what this means is that you have to actually be careful with who your primary enemies are. Are you willing to set aside everything that your nation and your heritage is to get the commies? Or is the people actually seeking to destroy the character of your nation that's the primary enemy? So that's the dynamic that's going on here. This is the mechanism that the National Review right and the neoconservatives use to sideline and basically destroy the old right. So that's the last thing I wanted to say on that. Do you have anything to add before we move on?
With respect to the coalition, not so much. I think that the other thing to consider in this is also a great geographic transition. So as I mentioned, of course, a lot of the old right, as we know it, were men of industry or had connections towards what San Francisco might call Middle America, but the transition really does emerge as the demographics and the intelligentsia stays where the intelligentsia is known at. And so there's this big thrust to stay in places like Washington, D.C., Manhattan, and other parts of New York City, as well as in Sacramento, San Francisco, and Chicago. And so there's this great geographic bridge to where major cities of immigrant populations throughout the 1950s and 60s, after the post-war immigrants come into the United States, that now we're witnessing a fundamental transformation of this coalition coming together. And that baiting also plays a huge role with respects to trying to maintain the character of the nation, because of course Buckley would famously pen in The Search of Anti-Semitism and in other, and he's written numerous other essays trying to drag out any potential faction or camp, whether it be the Birchers or those that are further to the right of himself, in order to ensure that he has the narrative and political control over where conservatism in the United States would go as he sees fit.
Right, and it's yeah. So the red baiting was just the first iteration, but it was the most major one by far. As you mentioned, there was the anti-Semitism stuff. So it turns out members of the old right weren't really politically correct, and they have these weird notions that, I mean, great conservative Christian academics today, like Neil Shinvey, tell me are actually Marxists in origin. These old right opponents in the New Deal had these weird notions that the founding stock of the country should remain the majority, and that it's actually their heritage that the country was founded for. So this is a fundamental transformation, and of course that would get the old right also hit on things like racism, xenophobia, basically every ism and phobia that we've heard the far left today use was originally employed by the new right against the old right, which really should tell you something. If the new right was using basically every left-wing tool that we have witnessed in our lifetimes, it really does beg the question, why are they called the new right? But that's probably a different stream entirely if one were to jump into everything that they did. So that's it's worth noting. Red baiting was the first iteration of this. Every other ism and phobia and whatever else was used. Bill Buckley quite famously resented being called a bigot. And this wasn't just like some old school academia at play here. Buckley, I certainly believe, was very much against bigotry, broadly defined, defined as the media would define it. I have no doubt that he was, but I definitely know that most members of the old right did not care if they were called bigots, especially in the sense that we now call it, because the old right was preserving something that, it could be bigotry, if you want to view it that way. But most sane people would see that what the old right was preserving was something that took many generations to build, of a very specific stock of people, that had very specific attributes that can't really be, or at least hasn't been replicated elsewhere. So, yeah, maybe that is bigotry, but preserving that to the old right was worth it. This sort of new right types that were very concerned with sensibilities of the media, of interviewers, of the general public as they are informed by the media. They would rather sell out anything to avoid being called these things. So, yeah, that's just to move on quickly so we don't keep belaboring this. Around the 1980s, 1990s, we get sort of like the third and final major part of this new right coalition that comes to the forefront. And it somewhat has to do with Ronald Reagan being the National Review section of this coalition's main presidential candidate. And of course, he went on to win bigly. In the 1980s and 90s, we really see the ascendancy of Christian conservatism. This is not to say that there weren't conservatives who were Christian or Christians who were conservative before this, but the really distinct political identity that most Americans remember when they think about the 80s and 90s and Christian conservatism, this is when that group really comes to the forefront and sort of amalgamates with the neoconservatives, which once again are distinct. They are definitely to the left of the National Review, and definitely to the left of these Christian conservatives, and of which the Christian conservatives are probably the center of this coalition. They really start to amalgamate. And definitely in the modern day, we can't really distinguish between the three anymore. Bill Buckley he's gone. Most of the neoconservatives are gone. It's mostly just their children that are left, and even they are getting pretty old. And the leaders of this Christian conservative movement, when it first gained relevance, are either dead or they're irrelevant now. Most of this coalition's descendants in the modern day are some amalgamation of these three, much to the detriment, I would think, of Christian conservatism in the United States. So, this Christian conservative coalition is within the Reagan coalition. They exercise great power within it. They get more power with Bush 1 and Bush 2, both of which use the exact same coalitions that we're describing here. This is sort of like the culmination of this whole thing. So we started with this like National Review right that was emerging. The neoconservatives came along quickly, and then finally we've added in this Christian conservative movement, which has very popular preachers in the media, but also a pretty hefty academic sphere. So this is really sort of completing, basically, establishment right-wing politics as we've understood it throughout our lifetimes today. This is the origin story of this coalition. The Christian conservatives basically eliminated any distinct identity that they had and sold that in exchange for tying themselves irreversibly to this National Review right neoconservative coalition. And this is very important to understand. Certainly now in the modern day, maybe you could have immediately after they did this, in the modern day, you cannot disaggregate the Christian conservatives and the other two groups of this coalition. They very often come down to the exact same person who holds neoconservative views, National Review right-wing views, and Christian conservative views. Christian conservatism is not a distinct identity anymore. It is just one element that went into this coalition. I would call it a Faustian bargain, but I don't really know that they got much out of it to begin with. So, this is the right-wing establishment coalition that we've seen today. If you read Rothbard's book, which once again I highly recommend it, not because I just think that anything Rothbard writes is gospel, but because he hits the nail on the head here. This right wing that was really concerned with placating the establishment and gently replacing it goes very much against the old right. The old right was very much populist, not revolutionary, but they were certainly not pro-establishment. They didn't want to conform to the establishment. The old right would have viewed that as a way of sort of like the New Deal and these other New Deal interested lefties and righties winning if you had to start conforming yourself to their opinions. The National Review right, the neoconservatives and the Christian conservatives, they just sought to become the establishment. They just wanted to govern. This is the primary goal, if you were to attach one very simple primary goal to this coalition. And they did achieve that. They became the establishment. And this isn't like college radicalism where suddenly if you reach the seats of government you become the establishment. That's not what I'm saying here. Rather, they completely conformed everything that they had to fit the views of the prior establishment, which would have been this old left, new left coalition that emerged in tandem, if you will, with this old right fight against the new right, which they lost. They very much conform themselves, which is why you don't really hear much about racism if you read the old right, whereas racism is a primary issue for this new right coalition, which I think that we can see today that's kind of in the process of being repudiated. All this is building up to say, and I think this can simplify because I don't know if I need to really litigate the 1980s and 90s and 2000s for people here. I think you can kind of see where this is all leading. The new right gets its years of governing under Reagan, under Bush 1, and under Bush 2. They got 2 full-term presidencies and one 4-year presidency. And what did they do with this? Because that's a pretty powerful time frame. Well, the left gained unprecedented power in the United States. They took over the university systems. American foreign policy became the most interventionist that it ever had. The right wing was on the verge of being completely destroyed. I mean, this is sort of like the years where everything hung in the balance. The paleo-libertarians were a tiny movement that could have just dispersed. The paleoconservatives were holding on by the breadth of their teeth. They could also have been dispersed. And everything was increasingly being labeled as far right, while the public didn't really even notice because they were being very much conditioned by the media to view these things as just outside the pale to begin with. So what we have is a public moving ever increasingly leftward due to a already left-wing media, and the new right coalition has just decided to give them everything that they want, because really what it came down to when the new right got power, the things that they were most concerned with was number one, looking like Christian conservatives, and number two, intervening as much as possible in foreign affairs, regardless of how much money or manpower or distortions upon our everyday lives that took. And number three, making sure that they appealed to the sensibilities of academics and the media, which is the primary attribute of the National Review right. So that's this new right coalition. I think especially for your audience, I don't really need to go into why all of this is bad. I think they can kind of just intuitively see that this Frankenstein's monster of a new right coalition is probably everything that we've come to despise, and rightfully so. They're the people that prevent actual solutions from being enacted, from a real right from rising and sort of resupplanting itself as a successor of the old right. It's this inherently moderating force from the get-go that's prevented the paleo-libertarians and the paleoconservatives from retaking the levers of power. This is bad, very clearly. And what's more is they do not see the left as being the ultimate enemy. They will have a whole bunch of bluster, they'll put on a whole bunch of shows and whatnot else to make you think that. But just looking from their actions, they willingly cede universities, the state and local governments, military positions, bureaucracies, the legislative houses, and whatnot else to the left, but they will not ever tolerate anyone too far to the right from saying anything bigoted or racist or anti-Semitic or whatever else. So this is what we've been left with today, and bringing us to the election. This is why I was so interested. It seemed like this coalition really lost, even though the GOP won. The National Review right, the Christian conservatives, the neoconservatives are basically gone, so they no longer factor in really to what we discussed. Their ideas live on, but the neoconservatives themselves are gone mostly. The National Review right and the Christian conservatives hated the outcome of this last election. They hated Trump. They really wanted a federal abortion ban, and if not, they wanted every state to ban abortion. And fine, I am not going to defend abortion any time in my lifetime. But quite interestingly, I don't think that these groups were wanting to ban abortion because they just really dislike abortion. Rather, they dislike that the populists have taken control of the GOP and have moved past this issue. This is why we didn't see calls for a federal abortion ban until suddenly Trump got the nomination, and until Trump refused to do this completely innovative move. Interestingly, for these so-called conservatives, especially in the legal sphere, we've never had a federal abortion ban, nor would we have ever been founded with one. This was something that developed naturally across every state. So, regardless of one's opinions on the issue, it's not the conservative position to support a federal abortion ban. Rather, it seems like a spiteful position taken to bait out the populists in the GOP. Interestingly, these populists in the GOP did not get baited, which is more than can be said for the old right. They got red baited pretty hard. The current populists in the GOP did not get abortion baited. So that's my assessment, Prude. I don't know where you want to go from there, but I thank you for the monologue.
Oh, no. I think that it's always good when people get to hear you speak, especially on the history of sort of conservative movements. And everything that we've cited, I will make sure that there are links for in the description so you can listen and read and see for yourself. That way the audience knows as well that we're not coming from a place where we're pulling this history out of a hat or out of our respective rear ends. This is very well documented as to what has taken place. So no, I would agree with you with respect to the election cycle that this election, whether it be the new right, the neoconservatives, or the Christian conservatives that have basically said that Trump is too soft on a particular social issue and asking for something that has never existed in the nation's history, simply to morally grandstand against him. And I mean, this was the same thing that we saw as well as in 2016. There were quite a few people within G3 Ministries, and I think some of the Acts 29 network that were out and about asking for permission to vote for Hillary Clinton as well. And of course, now we've seen this great turn to liberalize and purge and red bait the churches in the United States, and especially within its Protestant denominations, but also the other churches as well. And so for me, watching the election play out, the question now is always going to be that the left is an enemy, and it will always be an enemy. But I also know that a traitor is worse than an enemy, and anyone trying to contain me from my quote unquote right has been and always will be a greater problem. And so to witness, whether it be the Matt Gaetz situation for the Attorney General nomination, or the bureaucracy and so many Republicans having no problem voting for all of Biden's picks for the cabinet level. I mean, Alejandro Mayorkas, a man who should not, under any circumstance, be in the United States to begin with, was brought into his position with no votes, really preventing him from getting into that position from the Senate using their advice and consent role per the American Constitution. And so to witness that happen, of course, illustrates this has been a decades old problem in American post-war conservatism, but also the term new right itself. So, for instance, Sam Francis, Bob Whitaker, and numerous others that would be called the New Right papers that we listed earlier. And you can find that to read for free via PDF as well as on the Internet Archive for those interested. They had called themselves the New Right. They did not want to be part of the Buckleyite or the National Review or neoconservative establishment that had made itself so well known in conservative circles. They wanted to be new. They wanted to illustrate that they were capable of doing things. These were very paleoconservative, but also very savvy men with respects to finance and fundraising and voter outreach, which felt very similar to me with Trump's strategy and working with TPUSA and the America PAC to target low propensity voters and to speak to them directly and to bypass the mainstream press and the mainstream media. And so we've got greater advantages via disintermediation today than they did, because we're not really going through a mailing list of potential fellow travelers, to borrow a term, and trying to let them know who to vote for on the key issues. Instead, we can just tweet it out directly and people can hear our takes on said issues or listen to this podcast like they can. So now the term new right has come again earlier in the last couple of years with that famous Vanity Fair article describing individuals like Curtis Yarvin, Adrian Vermeule, J.D. Vance, Peter Thiel as sort of these ideological, intellectual giants as well as financial giants, purporting a movement that has sort of this one part Catholic, the public good kind of social conservatism, which feels very social democratic. And if you read individuals like Sohrab Ahmari or Neil Shenvi, you definitely see that. And then at the same time, this technocratic Californian ideology, libertarianism, that the state has to get out of America's way in order for the business of America to resume, echoing some very 1920s economic positions, and at least rhetorically speaking. So there's that, but also they're nowhere near the levers of power in terms of academia, or more importantly, the halls of power in Washington with congressional staff and within the bureaucracy. And of course, they still have the backing of the media and virtually every other power node outside of, say, Twitter and Donald Trump's national campaign, at least as a organizing political body that can get people out to vote and have backers and financiers. And you see this very clearly with respects to the 2024 election and who is financially supporting who. Kamala Harris, despite the awkwardness of the coalition with, say, especially with October 7th in mind, just by having a tenuous coalition that often gets called the Rainbow Coalition or the Obama Coalition, kind of fell apart, despite the fact that an overwhelming majority of her backers financially were Jewish, whereas Trump, while being more pro-Israel and more pro the Republican status quo with respects to America's relationship to that country, had less, Jewish financial backing, and then at the same time had a far more diverse backing with respects to um, its class of who was giving money, whether it be small businesses, large media owners, as well as an upswing in the tech sector. So we're witnessing, I don't want to call it a realignment, but I think that we're seeing new trenches being dug of a decades old battle when it comes to what is conservatism, what is right wing in America, and can we even preserve or maintain a functional majority of its founding stock?
Right, and since baiting and moderating and all these other things have been a constant and clear theme coming from the bad part, the subversive part of the right, it might be good to sort of just look right now at what can we be baited against. I already mentioned that there's like social conservatism baiting, abortion baiting, gay marriage baiting, whatever else, where these Christian conservative holdovers, these people that have completely lost any engine of relevance or any mandate from people, they'll basically just try to get you on some socially conservative position that they're technically more traditional than you are with. So this is one form of baiting that I especially think a lot of people on the online right now are learning to distinguish against. 4 years ago, the most socially conservative possible was the best, and that was just the end of it. It was a very one-dimensional analysis, and that allowed a lot of subversives to crawl in. We've since learned that just being socially conservative is not, in fact, all that it takes to be right-wing. So there are other things, but I would like to talk about, since there's anyone can come up with a list of these. They're pretty intuitive for us to see, especially in these spheres, because we kind of made it here because we saw through this at least implicitly. We might not have explicitly thought this is baiting me to go to the left or something like that, but we certainly didn't fall for it when we saw it. A very important thing that I'm seeing is that there's an uptick in interventionism rhetoric coming from people that should know better at this point, because this is one thing that really hasn't changed in the last 80 years or so of the United States, is that every time there's an uptick in interventionism rhetoric and the fervor for warfare, every single time the actual right gets shafted, it gets sidelined. You get because you think that there are bigger enemies than whatever that we're going against right now, be it China or Russia or whatever else. You're going to get branded publicly as a defeatist or as someone who's not serious or whatever else, and you're going to be sidelined, and you're inevitably going to be sidelined by people who are more moderate than you are. So I think this is something that we really should guard against, is these forms of baiting, especially people trying to bait us away from right-wing positions who are themselves to our left, even though they frame it as to being to our right. So I've seen this in the church conflicts that I've been in, where a lot of people will try to pull out quotes or whatnot that superficially seem to justify their completely anti-racist and anti-fascist positions, which is very strange because I don't think anti-racism nor anti-fascism existed in the church fathers, but this is what they'll try to do. They'll try to bait you against it. And the correct move here is not to refute them. It's not to give them a ton of airtime and try to dismantle them. It is quite simply to ignore it and move on. Because if this is also important to note. If someone is baiting you, that is because they cannot just remove you immediately. There would be no need to bait you if they could just remove you. So, this is important. I think you can't fall into this trap of being baited. This is where the old right failed, which includes many of our most beloved people that we read, but it's still a failure on their part. So that's something that I wanted to say there. More to the I would also just like to say this to some of the audience as well. Maybe consider that some of the stuff that you rag on libertarianism for or whatnot else may actually be a more historical example of your Anglo-American countrymen than the super based social welfare system that you're advocating for from the right, or whatnot else. So this is you mentioned the sort of the common good Catholics that are sort of infiltrating the right, which were pretty clearly we pretty clearly saw that that was happening. I don't think there was much lost there, but this is something to consider. The way that they got into their positions, they said, "Hey, this free market stuff is actually really left wing. We really need a social welfare system to support the underclasses in society." Of course, you can't say that publicly while also couching it with any sort of discriminatory rhetoric, because then you're almost certainly going to get axed from wherever you are. So they weren't doing that. They were advocating for just welfareism, basically for everyone that wanted to come here. Um, that's easy to see through. We can all see that that's bad, especially for the founding stock of the country. What's not so easy to see through is just the welfareism itself might not be the most American thing to be advocating for. Maybe the common good stuff is not in fact good. Is something else that a lot of people always get baited on. It seems that the default position now is to accept basically just neoconservative economics because that sounds more right wing than whatever the libertarians are doing, and the libertarians can't seem right wing because they're all gay now. So this is something that might have to be resourced on the right as well. So that's why I wanted to say there. This baiting stuff is vitally important to understand.
Yeah, we are going to see a lot more of it come in, and I do think that we're going to witness a cycle of it continue on, and we've already sort of noticed that already. And to refer back to San Francisco, or these intelligentsia centers, I mean, Manhattan, of course, is going to be an area to keep a close eye on and to be very, very tactful about how you engage, if at all, especially with regards to these accusations of racism or discrimination, or to be considered fanciful and not being politically realistic, despite the fact that your stated goals or your stated political positions are no different than what would have been described by any of our old right thinkers and compatriots from decades past. And I think that that's sort of important to consider, especially in the wake of all of this energy and money. I think that you can sort of see where some hands might want to steer the rudder on interventionism, whether it be about the Middle East, or whether it be trying to be more hawkish with China, or trying to escalate the situation that is currently ongoing in Ukraine. So obviously, these three areas, which have historically already been areas in which the United States have been engaged in, whether it's during the Cold War, whether it be the global war on terror, or our pivot to Asia under the Obama administration, and now with a much more hawkish attitude that has been upped in ante in the Biden administration. It raises very significant concerns. And of course, on top of that, you have to seriously consider the fact that since October 7th, you've seen what I've jokingly said tongue in cheek, but I think it's rather accurate, a sort of Potterit cycle restart itself, wherein certain racial and social issues in the United States begin to affect a certain set of minorities, especially in this instance, Jewish academics, progressives, liberals, and realizing that these things affect them now. Well, they've quote unquote been mugged by reality. And so now that they've kind of seen their sway to the right, and you've noticed this with Bill Ackman and numerous members of the Manhattan Institute and the rest. And so I think that you're going to have to watch that cycle emerge, because the old class of neoconservatives are not as prominent as they are. I mean, even Norman Podhoretz himself, his son, John Podhoretz, who was a speechwriter for George H.W. Bush, has definitely gotten up there in age. And in fact, October 7th was the one thing that brought him to Twitter after the 2020 election. So we'll see what happens with that sort of movement of things. But they've all sort of made themselves either anti-Trumpers or have embraced the social mores of the day and realized that maybe they're a negative impact for their own specific interests. So this, desire to have a multi-ethnic working class populism, or to have this intellectual vanguard at the front of it, I see very familiar battles playing out in the future, where individuals will be canceled for their positions on things that I find to be rather principled, in the same way that Joseph Sobran or Patrick Buchanan had been slandered by mainstream conservatives in the Republican Party.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't really have much more to add on that. I think that you've perfectly summarized everything that's been going on, sort of like this reemergence of the neoconservatives. That's quite amazing to watch.
It's unreal to witness that the sort of American political goldfish memory take its place, where we're sort of witnessing. I almost feel like Marty McFly from Back to the Future. It's like, hey, I've seen this one before, and everyone else is looking at you as if you are some crazy person. Like, what do you mean? This is all brand new to me. Isn't this exciting? And it's like, no, I've seen this before. I promise. This is a rerun or a remake of a story I have seen play out many times before. But as we get close to the end here, Ryan, I wanted to ask you, where do you see with this new administration? I know that he has not been sworn in yet. We've not witnessed his first 100 days. But where do you think broadly we're going to see the direction of the right go, and this new right in the 2020s go?
Right. So, like I have my OGC article where I basically just said that if there was ever anyone to completely dismantle the existing left wing coalition and just leave them in the dust, uh, not necessarily this administration is the person, but now is the time to do it if there is someone that can. So this is my reason for being optimistic. Is just that like everything, or at least at the time when I wrote it, everything was there to play out. We'll see if the Gates AG stuff was a loss or not in time, I suppose. But um, so with the current administration, there's very clearly a tenuous coalition, mostly due to the existence of Congress, between this populist repudiation of the Christian conservative, neoconservative, National Review Right coalition, and then that coalition itself, because for whatever accident of history, they both found themselves under the same party. So what I expect to happen is that the groups closest to us are going to be like the technocrats coming out of Silicon Valley. That's not to say that I endorse Silicon Valley technocracy. In fact, I find it quite abhorrent and exceedingly atheistic. But that is definitely going to be where the only opening is for us. I don't think that the more populist types are going to present a way forward for us. They can definitely do things in our favor. This was the appeal of DeSantis. DeSantis is not an our guy, but he does seem to make things very nice for us, at least to keep going. He's not a usual business as usual GOP guy, and he's not a leftist, which basically means that we get more time to do things. So the populists, I don't think, are going to be like the way forward for us. I do think that the only place that we can actually exercise influence is the Silicon Valley types. And the reason I say that, the thing that caused me to form this opinion, is because of the interactions between Musk and Ron Paul on Twitter. And this is very interesting. Ron Paul was like the only candidate for multiple election cycles representing this old right philosophy. Many paleoconservatives liked Ron Paul for a reason beyond just the usual paleo-libertarians. And this is because Ron Paul is, all of his policies and his orientation seems to generally be good for the American people, especially the founding stock of the country. Beyond just the libertarian stuff, which is why paleo-libertarians like myself or Austro-libertarians like him. The Silicon Valley types are talking very favorably of Ron Paul. That's very interesting because Ron Paul is not a technocrat, which signals to me that even though we have mentally slotted these Silicon Valley technocrats like Musk or Thiel or Ramaswamy as technocrats, the thing that they're ultimately shooting for is not governmental technocracy, but rather just market technocracy, which is a different beast. It's not something that I prefer, but I definitely think that it's a lot less destructive than most of our other options. After all, if you do just let the business run free, if you do just get out of the way of business, let Americans do things, let entrepreneurs do things, it makes perfect sense that everything would shift to the right. because suddenly we're not subsidizing all of these people that are leftists. If we got rid of welfare, if we got rid of business regulations and all this other stuff, all the unions would dissipate, which is a pretty massive section of the Democratic Party establishment and a lot of their city center or city power center money supplies. The unions would dissipate. A lot of their money would decrease in proportion because suddenly all these uh, market successful entrepreneurs, um, they would have much more money, which gives the right and potentially us more to work with. This is where I generally see things going. I think that us here on like the newest right, if you will, the more traditional historical right, for whatever reason, the only people that seem interested in us are the hyper modernists, the market accelerationists. So I don't know why. I couldn't explain to you why that is. I don't know the dynamics there, but that's the clear signal that's being sent whenever someone like Musk talks with Ron Paul, whenever you have Musk commenting on anons on Twitter, whenever you have Musk freeing Twitter for anons, he has not been the greatest defender of anonymity, and he's made signals against it. Hasn't happened yet, though. We haven't been forced to give up anonymity on Twitter. And really, right now, all he's done is just freed the discourse for anons to completely curb stomp academics and the former blue checkmark class. So I don't know why that's the case. That's where I see most of our value lying, most of our future lying, is with this ascendant market accelerationist technocratic group.
I'm inclined to agree with you that those are the only ones listening to us, and that there has been, in part due to these uh, technocratically minded, or at least the accelerationist, with their, let America grow, let America be what America has always been, this engine of ingenuity and innovation, because we can't have that right now. And I mean, even for Jeff Bezos, to who owns the Washington Post and Amazon, to basically not offer an endorsement was as clear a sign as any to say, vote with your conscience, or obviously that Kamala is not good for business, and what's good for business is good for America, is this, very old idea from the 1920s that has definitely reemerged into the Silicon Valley consciousness that we have right now. And I think that they'll have a very uphill battle with the establishment, who has no problem doing minor reform or talking about how things have been a failure, but they're so intractable that we can't really do much about it. I mean, even if you were to take something like Paul Ryan's position to make entitlements solvent, and this was after 2012, but he was when he was House Speaker, and he was talking about how the war on poverty had been failed, and we had spent $1 trillion and it made things worse. Even if you were to implement something like that, would be a vast improvement. But to see something like the Department of Government, efficiency, while of course is to pump a well popular meme coin for the crypto markets, to actually sit down and ask the question, what do you do here in government, and what are you actually benefiting the American people, is a mindset that is such a warm welcome to see again. That government is meant to serve the people, and that if you are not serving the American people or providing any kind of net benefit, then you should be axed, and that you should be thrown out of public service, and for good. So it's heartwarming to see. I know that it will be an incredibly uphill battle, but I think that to see this, the world's richest man come onto this side of things, as I've said elsewhere in other streams and other podcasts, that it has gotten so bad in the United States that the fundamental question of, can we even deem ourselves a civilization, when you have hordes of criminals chasing after trains out of Los Angeles to rob Amazon packages, corrupt, district attorneys being complicit with George Soros and the others, acting as traitors, akin to Judas Iscariot of the American people, and letting immigrants who aren't even immigrants, they're just people who are here, being parasitical off of the public dollar, to kill people and to get life in prison rather than to be executed or deported. They have a very large uphill battle, and of course, they will have to deal with the demographic makeup of the country as well as the demographic makeup of our current business and political elites. But there is a sliver of hope because whether it's Vivek Ramaswamy or Mark Andreessen talking about James Burnham or talking about older libertarian ideas and saying nice things about Ron Paul, there is hope for that, and they have sort of the means and the money to potentially put the groundwork in to do something that our friends of the old right couldn't.
Right, and this is also kind of why I'm optimistic. The old right was especially good for the time, but since this is the arena of politics, and since we have new battles, we would expect things to change. This is not me suddenly becoming a progressive, since they've basically ripped this argument completely out of its historical context, where suddenly, because we grant that change should happen at certain times, that means that we must change for the sake of it as an end. That's the more atheistic version of progressivism. Rather, even the most ardent traditionalist from, say, the 18th century would acknowledge that things are supposed to change. So, whenever the old right was around, obviously it wasn't fit for purpose because it lost quite brutally. But it also would not be good to just bring it back one for one right now. We've learned things that are better applied right now. Specifically, it's not just like the New Deal or market interventionism or the North or whatever else are the big enemies. Rather, it's just leftism that's the enemy, and it needs to be rooted out entirely from the roots. This is not something that's an old right idea. In fact, this is something from uh, the the new right, a la Sam Francis. This is the left is the enemy. This is a newer idea. So I am more optimistic, especially because those aforementioned technocrats seem much more geared towards combating the left, at least a little bit. Every once in a while, you'll see someone like Musk makes a much more moderate statement, like he's still just a liberal or whatnot else. But that's not what his actions are telling me. His actions are not telling me that he's just a liberal, because if he was just a liberal, I don't think he would have just bought Twitter to force it to have free dialogue. While that is a liberal policy, this isn't just liberal. What that is Musk taking a major channel of information away from the left and forcing it into a position where he isn't responsible for what's being said on there, but it just so happens that the left is being curb stomped rhetorically day by day on there. They're losing quite horrifically. So yeah, liberal policy, but the actions don't signal to me that he is just some moderate lefty type. I think that's especially where a lot of our people go wrong, is that they kind of underestimate Musk. And he's we also tend to forget that he boosts, for whatever reason, racial crime statistics on Twitter multiple times. He's done this in the past. I think this is more signaling to me that Musk is having perhaps some sort of reminiscence on, say, South Africa and how it declined, and he probably doesn't want that to happen here. This is not to say that Musk is like some ardent Afrikaner racialist, but I think he's a bit more than just a liberal, and I think this is good for us. He's fighting the left, and that's the main enemy, and it always will be. I genuinely don't know if we can conceive of a world where there's an enemy greater than the left that's currently next to us. It's always going to lead to some sort of demise. And to be clear, this includes the Christian conservative academia and the evangelical elite that we've seen emerge in the last couple of decades. For all intents and purposes, they are the left. They argue about critical theory, the Frankfurt School, neo-Marxism, and whatever other pop term they've come up with. But they are, at the end of the day, just mad because they abandoned the civil rights form of leftism that they believe just stopped magically in 1965, and they just kept going down the logical chain of conclusions. Both of these groups are just seeking to destroy us, or moderate us and therefore destroy us. And interestingly, these technocrats don't seem to be drawn in. This is one of the virtues of their atheism, is that they have no relationship, and therefore the clergy class has no pull over the technocrats. That can be bad, and especially if they get, say, total control. I don't want a transhumanist cyberpunk world in my future. But if they don't get total power, it's good for us because suddenly these infinitely moderating forces called Christian conservatism, which, by the way, in Rothbard's book, is noted to be the first attacks, they originate the first attacks against the old right. Methodist ministers and then other, usually mainline clergy types, they were the ones to start the criticisms against the old right. Not having that influence here with this one faction that's favorable towards us is very much in our benefit right now. So I don't know what we can do to capitalize on that right now, but this is the lay of the land as I see it.
Yeah, my optimism ranges on the fact that they are not attacking us and they are not fundraising for people that hate me or that it will stymie any of my efforts. And for that, that is a great welcome. And I hope that it continues, even if I may disagree on some parts. But they seem to inherit that old idea of wanting to be left alone, which oftentimes gets lambasted for perhaps political fantasy, but they're wanting to return to let America be America, or to let Americans innovate and not to be shackled down by DEI or lax on crime policies is welcoming to see. So I do hope that Trump and Elon Musk follow through on their campaign promises, and that Musk has threatened with the America PAC to primary and support those that are not on board with this Make America Great Again agenda, which would be finally the useful form of the right-wing billionaire that I keep hearing all these leftists screech about, where finally there's someone that seems to want to play the game to win, like busing people to go vote. Who would have thought that that would actually go somewhere for Republican politics if you got people to the polling location and actually got them to vote? So I remain cautiously optimistic. This could be one of those podcast episodes that ages like wine or ages like milk. But nevertheless, we have a great deal of history that we can look back on and work with. And hopefully now with this new class of elite defections, or these sort of business libertarian types, that there is a good chance that progress can be made in the conservative right-wing sense of that term.
Yes, I agree, and I don't really have anything to add.
Well, with that, I think that'd be a good place to put a pin in it then. Ryan, what are you doing? Where can people find you, and what are you working on?
So most recently, you can find me at the Old Glory Club, especially their Substack. I've had a few articles go out in the last few months. Beyond that, I haven't really been doing much online. You can find my Twitter at Turnip Merchant, or if you just search the name that you see here on your screen, Ryan Turnipseed, you can find me on Twitter. There I am waging the rhetorical and media war against Christian conservatism. Hopefully we can dispense ourselves with it and move on to something better, something right-wing after that. But you can find most of that movement there. Besides that, I have a YouTube channel that I haven't used in a while, but especially relating to the neocons part of this new right coalition. You can find the 4-part series that I did over there that also had you, Prude, I believe, for at least one of them. It was the one on Kirkpatrick. I forget. Were you on any of the other ones?
I was on for Kirkpatrick, and then I think the last time I was over on your channel was just to discuss the Dobbs decision being leaked. Right. So it's been a hot minute.
Right. Okay. So yeah, you can find my channel also here on YouTube, Ryan Turnipseed, where I go through what the neoconservatives themselves actually wrote. Yes, they were rabid interventionists. No, they weren't everything that the current GOP is right now. So this is perhaps if you're interested more in this, you can go and see what we made of their writings themselves over on my channel. And then you can find some of my more economic or Austro-libertarian writings at Mises.org under my name. So I believe that's everything for me to shill here.
Well, as always, Ryan, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this topic. You are a well-read and well-spoken gentleman, and this will, of course, be available for channel members and patrons first, and it should be out in the coming weeks ahead. And with that, I hope that you all have a great rest of your day, morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you may be listening to this. And remember, it's not over until you say it's over, so never give up.